Back in the day, before streaming, before CDs, we listened to music on albums. A vinyl disc spinning 33 and a third revolutions per minute brought us great music one side at a time. 20 or so minutes of music, 4 or 5 songs usually, that created a single listening experience. This format exposed us to other songs of the artist, not just the hits, and often flowed in an order that was created to build and maintain or mold a musical experience for the listener.
Sideshow brings musical experiences from the past to life today. Here, we discuss and review individual sides of record albums we have grown to appreciate and hope you will too. Welcome to The Sideshow. All right, welcome to The Sideshow. Mark is first up today. Mark, what do you got?
Hey, I am going to be talking today about an album that I have enjoyed for about as long as any record in my collection, and that is Steely Dan Asia, Side 1. Now, I don't know if you can recall, Mike, but we actually got this album through the Columbia Record Club. We had signed up and picked out a bunch of different albums that we were going to get for a penny, and then didn't really think about anything past then. And suddenly, albums started showing up at our door where they wanted money from. And one of the earliest albums was Steely Dan Asia, which we had not ordered or wanted, but it showed up at our door.
I recall the deal there is, the club had the record of the month, and if you wanted it, you did nothing.
Yes.
If you didn't want it and you did nothing, you got it, because you had to like say no. You had to send them I think you had to mail them a letter, or you had to check a box off on a form and send it in. Otherwise, you would automatically get it and then be responsible for paying for it. But
yes.
And I think that's how we got that. But it turned out to be fortuitous, I would say, because
it did. I would agree. In fact, it's kind of interesting because, like, keeping up with the record club took a level of responsibility and follow through that we did not necessarily possess at that age. However, something that we also did not possess at that age was any type of aversion to new music. No. So one of the first things that we did when we got it was said, well, let's put it on and listen to it. And we did. And again, I have listened to it thousands of times since.
And Steely Dan was an established, mainstream band at that time. What was it, 76 or 77 that album came out?
77.
77. And, stuff like songs like Do It Again or Reelin' in the Years or Ricky Don't Lose That Number and others were, they were on the radio. And and even though we hadn't, been listening to albums by Steely Dan at that point, it wasn't like, oh, this is some obscure, what is this stuff here, And,
yeah.
But I can still remember when we got that and had it at the house. I believe when we still shared a bedroom.
Exactly. And a fine stereo system that I think came from our parents to listen to music at. So it was actually, and it was. They were an established band at that time. In 1977, Asia came out. It was their 6th studio album, and all of their albums were, fairly successful. As their 6th album, starting out in 72, their first album, Can't Buy a Thrill, that had, songs again like Do It Again and Dirty Work and Reelin' in the Years, which is probably their to this day their biggest hit and is still a popular song. 73, Countdown to Ecstasy, songs like My Old School, which are still Steely Dan favorites. 74, Pretzel Logic, Ricky Don't Lose That Number, Any Major Dude. Again, songs that continue to hit the airwaves. 1975, probably Katie lied. Black Friday was came from that album, 1976. The Royal Scam, songs like Kid Charlemagne. And these are all
Yeah.
albums. All of them, with the exception of Countdown to Ecstasy, are platinum albums, and they all contained a number of radio hits. So to your point, they were a very established band, and they even followed up Asia with in 1980 with Gaucho, and Steely Dan was so dependably successful that Gaucho was the kind of the trial balloon where the record companies looked to raise prices for record albums
Yeah, I can remember
from
that.
from around $5 a piece to around $7. And the one that they did that with was Gaucho, to test that. Of
I
course, it was also a platinum album.
I can remember the gal at Beggar's Tune in Appleton, which was
Yep.
one of the kind of combination record store head shop places. There was Beggar's Tune and Pipe Dreams,
Mm-hmm.
where they sold records, they sold
Yes.
albums, and along with items that were not intended to be used for the purpose of ingestion of controlled substances, or
Yes.
at least that's what the sign on the wall said.
Yes. Yes.
But she, in any case, this woman that worked at Beggar's Tune, I can remember her saying like, I was in just looking at records and like, oh yeah, the new Steely Dan is out and they're jacking up the prices and people are buying it. You shouldn't buy them. Let the record companies know. It's just sort of power to the people
Yeah.
kind of thing. And I never actually purchased the album. Although I ended up getting the Citizen Steely Dan box set eventually, which has all of the stuff, including all
Yes.
of Gaucho, and interesting to note when Gaucho came out in was 1980 maybe,
Yeah.
um,
1980.
and one of the hits on that album was Hey 19, and
Yep.
it's they were writing about their inability to relate to the younger generation,
Mm-hmm.
and like Donald Fagen was 30 at the time. I'm like, oh
Yes.
yeah, oh boy, these and he's like an old fart trying to deal with these young women basically.
Yes. Yeah.
But no, Steely Dan, a great band. I mean, and one of the quintessential American rock bands of the 70s, really.
And very especially in their album production, I guess I'd label them technically efficient, and it's much deeper than that, but a part of it was they had the same producer and same engineer for all of those albums. Gary Katz producing it, and Roger Nichols as their engineer, and the ability to work as a team like that, especially working with the composers or the songwriters of the band, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, who essentially became Steely Dan. In the early albums, they actually had a functional band of 6 or 7 musicians, including Skunk Baxter, who went on to the Doobie Brothers after the work that he had done with them, as well as Michael McDonald, who did some work with both Steely Dan and obviously the Doobie Brothers as well. But over time, they began to really want to focus more in the studio, and the regular band members began to peel away, and they focused more on actually just using studio musicians to do a lot of their work. In some cases, as is in the case with Asia, leveraging over 40 different studio musicians to do the work that was necessary to get the album out, and very focused on that. And these, with the production and the engineering team, and then Fagen and Becker, they really became a tight team that obviously got very good at making albums. And Asia was one of them.
Well, they started using studio musicians, like session players,
Yes.
on Pretzel Logic. So the first 2 albums was sort of the band, in addition to Jeff Baxter. I believe there's another guitarist named Denny Diaz. Can't remember the name of the drummer. They started to bring on additional musicians, but some those guys like Diaz and Baxter, I believe, stayed with them through Katie Lied, which was their 4th album, and but then eventually, like you say, it became more and more because they stopped touring.
Right
I
around the time
believe,
of Pretzel Logic.
yeah, yeah.
It was
So
when they stopped touring.
their studio focus eventually took over, and they determined they didn't necessarily have to have a working band for that reason. But uh, and one thing I was going to say is you mentioned that they were technically efficient. I think that most people would say they were technically proficient,
Mm-hmm.
but I've read places where a session musician would they'd be hired to come to the studio and they'd show up and they'd kind of say, well, geez, instead of playing music, they'd sit around all day trying to get like one drum shot on the snare right.
Yes, yes.
And so they kind of took their time, and it wasn't like a group of guys jamming in the studio. I mean, there was some very careful attention paid to the construction of their songs in the studio that some might say was not necessarily efficient. The final product was very good, but the process of getting there was kind of some of the musicians found it not what they were used to.
Oh, absolutely. And that was really the even leveraging that term at all, which was more about that core team and their ability to work together, production engineering, and then the musical talent themselves. I would absolutely agree. Their music was very complex. It was difficult to do well. In fact, they would sometimes bring in a session player who just couldn't do what they were looking to do, and they'd replace them. A lot of takes, a lot of post production work to try and get these songs right. So you're absolutely, absolutely correct. As far as this was, it can't be summed up just like, oh yeah, they were efficient. No, they were doing some very difficult work. And the end result in the Fact of Asia, I actually have the album here. This is what we got in the mail that day. This particular album, I've had it for a long time. One of the oldest albums in the collection. Very simple cover, yet it once you've seen it, it's very memorable, but simple and straightforward. Asia was said to be the name of a girlfriend or wife of a brother of one of their high school friends. And they don't necessarily know if the spelling was this, but someone that had gone off to Korea in the military and come back with a wife or girlfriend, and that was Asia. And then the back, very simple, just the specific songs itself. On the inside, and this was interesting, I still remember this, a lot of information on the inner cover, both from a musical reporter that was asked to cover them while they were recording some of this album, and the president of ABC Records also put some notes in here. Just a couple pictures, and then the sleeve itself has the lyrics for all the songs that are in there, as well as some information. Now, this particular album, speaking of Pipe Dreams and Beggar's Tune, close inspection of this album will actually reveal there's kind of a substance here, kind of a powdery substance that continues to this day to sit on this album that may have been left through the process of sorting the seeds out of some type of marijuana substance that could potentially have been used with this particular album. But that was a long time ago, and I've kind of lost any specific memory.
I believe what you meant to say was green leafy vegetable material.
Exactly. Exactly. One of the benefits of records this show is all about the joy of records and the physical records themselves, and that was a capability and a tool that you couldn't duplicate on a CD. So very good there. So
well, that's why single albums were released with a gatefold.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. They were done for a reason.
Yeah. In any event.
So let's talk about this album a little bit. We've talked about the band, and I'm going to focus on side one. I actually I really flipped a coin on which side that I wanted to do. I enjoy both sides of this album. I can listen to it start to finish and enjoy it. I think that the first side is actually a little more different, more unusual. than the second. The whole album has 7 songs on it. There's 3 on the first side, which we'll be talking about, 4 on the second. The actual bigger hits came from the songs Peg and Josie, which were on side 2, but we're going to talk about side 1 today. This was about 21 minutes in length, the whole side, 3 songs. And it started with a song called Black Cow. And this song was about, a guy looking or thinking about either a girlfriend of his, either at the end of a relationship or from a past relationship. There's a lot of back and forth, but he's got some cynical and not so necessarily positive things to say about her. And it really kind of starts out. There's a very soft kind of funky bass line that kind of quiet, but starts it out and the lyrics get started, and then it kicks in a little bit, and then basically becomes a fairly straightforward, verse and chorus, where one of the verses is, as we get farther into the song, is replaced with some piano music. We have another verse and chorus, and then we have a saxophone that's taking us out of the song. The structure itself is fairly straightforward, but the verses become very very complex. They're laid back, yet they kick in a little bit more, and you can feel some of the kind of the anger that this person has. Not anger is really the wrong word. The frustration that the singer has with this girlfriend, but there's also kind of a longing for the maybe the past time that they spent together that is now missing.
The a couple things. The opening bass line, I believe there's some clavinet in there and whatnot, but in like the early 2000s, a hip hop artist, and I don't recall the name of the artist or the song, but apparently used or sampled the that beginning of Black Cow, yes, for purposes of this song, and it kind of started a controversy. There was a practice of hip hop artists doing that, but now they were starting to put out records that were generating, yes, a certain amount of revenue, and apparently as they asked Steely Dan for permission. And Steely Dan said, "Well, yeah, but we want 100% of the royalties and $115,000 in cash." and apparently those requests were honored, and that turned out to be the only song that this hip hop artist did that generated any success.
Yes, that dwing don't and don't at the beginning of the song, exactly.
And then another fun fact. At the beginning, where the singer is speaking to the woman that you mentioned, who I agree with you. I mean, it seems like that whatever the details were, not the sort of woman you bring home to your parents.
Yes,
apparently,
yes.
But starts out, "In the corner of my eye, I saw you in Rudy's, and you were very high." Well, Rudy's is apparently a famous dive bar in Manhattan somewhere. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's in Greenwich Village or it's in New York City. I mean, the Donald Fagen and Walter Becker are from originally New York City.
Yes.
Yes. I think they spent most of their career making albums in Los Angeles, but they're New York guys.
Yes.
And apparently this place is like Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner used to go there to get away from the paparazzi and whatever.
Yes.
So it's a if you're in New York City and you live in Manhattan, you probably know when they refer to Rudy's. But I agree with your take on the song, I can remember the lyrics "break away" was one of the things that mm-hmm. stuck in my mind. And as a junior high kid, I mean, I didn't understand what they were specifically singing about, but I mean, break away. There was a book that was popular back in those days called Breaking Away, which I never read, but I imagined it was sort of about, getting away from the usual routine and going on to something different or better or less destructive, blah, blah, blah. But, mm-hmm. And that's the way that's the way that the language is used in the lyrics.
Yes.
Breaking away.
Yep.
You know, I'm maybe I should leave. You know, maybe I should leave you be.
Yes.
And maybe the world would be a better place if I wasn't, you know, sticking with you
Yes.
as a partner in life.
And it is, you bring up the point, and I do think it's important because it shows itself in a lot of their music. They were New York guys. In fact, they met in college in New York State, back in the late '60s. They did move out to L.A. where they did all their recording and that type of thing. And I think they had a notion of an L.A. West Coast band, but a lot of what they wrote about was from New York. And even the notion of a black cow being an undefined drink of some type, but that really came from their days when they were younger. They spent a lot of time in ice cream parlors and soda fountains, these types of things, as were when they first started to be thinking about or interacting with girls. So their past and where they came from reflects itself in a lot of their songs, especially in their earlier albums. But definitely some things there. One last fun fact about this song before we move on. They always had a sound in their head, and the saxophone run off to this at the end of the song. As we hear it kind of fading out, there is a saxophone solo, and they wanted the sound of the saxophone from the Tonight Show. They heard that every night. They'd hear the music there, and they actually went to the studio, and the saxophone player who played in the Tonight Show band did it. They spent about 30 minutes in the Tonight Show studio, and that's where this was recorded for this album. That was the sound they had in their head, and that's what they wanted to get. So they were willing to go mobile if they had to get the sound.
Well, and that's an example of, you know, what was mentioned earlier about how they wanted to get it just a certain way, and they'd keep banging away at it, and until they could. And here it's like, well, we want to, you know, instead of banging away, let's just go to the
Yeah.
Tonight Show studio and take care of it. And they were, when they were jazz guys. I mean, I think that they
Yes.
were also rock and roll guys. I mean, I don't think they could have band. You know, Steely Dan never would have become the band it did if they didn't have some sort of rock and roll spirit in them. But musically, you know, when they were gonna, you know, if they needed to go and kick back and use music as a way to get away or to as a release of some kind, jazz is what they were is what they would
Hmm.
put on the turntable. So they were, and what they really did is they managed to kind of fuse isn't necessarily the right word, but they managed to combine jazzy things with rock and roll, and weren't really a rock and roll band, weren't a jazz band. They kind of developed really a unique, like their own sound.
and
Um,
and difficult to classify or categorize is one of the common threads when you're reading music reviews from the time. I mean, for a lot of Steely Dan's records, but this one in particular. In fact, one reviewer put up that, look, Asia is as much of a jazz record as a pop record, though in its best moments, it's both and neither. It's just very difficult to classify this because there are times where you're clearly hearing this just very strong jazz influence and styles, yet pop and rock are a part of all of it as well. So it's one of the things about it that makes it interesting and unusual, while at the same time it feels very common to people. And I think that's because especially in listening to this, leading up to this, kind of working on our conversation today, I really kind of relived the fact that Steely Dan is really enjoyable at what I call any distance. By that I mean you can be really invested in, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to put some headphones on, I'm going to listen to this, I'm going to get very close to what's happening here. And in a lot of jazz music, I think if you really want to listen to it, enjoy it, you have to be that close to it. You have to really. It can be hard sometimes to listen and really capture what is happening. Yet this album is very enjoyable like that. It's also very enjoyable as you move away. It's on in the background in a party. It is something that you're listening to while you maybe doing other things. You can also enjoy it from a distance, and that makes it very unique in the fact that it's enjoyable kind of at any distance. There's some music that sounds great in the background, but when you really listen to it, it's like, wow, this is shit. And then the other way around as well. So I think it's one of the unusual things about it.
I agree that the intricacy of the music and the quality of the recordings make it good, sort of headphone candy music. But at the same time, you can have it on, if you got company over and you got a group of people that are sitting around talking, and the conversation rather than the music is the focus of what's happening, but having the same music on in the background, it works very well. To kind of finish up on the jazzy versus pop, there was a VH1 Classic Albums episode on Asia back whenever they were doing those, and a music critic said that he was talking about what the quote that you made from the liner notes about it's a little jazz, a little pop, and a lot of neither. Or I'm paraphrasing, but the metaphor that he used is that it's not pop, it's not jazz, but it's kind of like an alloy of those two metals, joined together, which results in a different kind of metal
altogether.
Altogether, it's like steel has iron in it, no pun intended, but it's different, and it's a newer, stronger sort of thing. So
really something different and uniquely Steely Dan. So the album then moves from Black Cow to Asia, the title track of the album, and this really is. It's kind of interesting that Asia is spelled AJA, but this song is about a sense of Asia and a feeling of the continent or the area of Asia or the Orient. It's a real strong feeling that you get from the song, and I get the sense when I listen to it that they kind of an attitude or a feeling that they retreat to when the rest of the world, the hustle bustle of the West Coast or whatever is working them hard. Asia, a kind of feeling or an attitude they take on helps them, whether it be relax or feel peace or whatever it is. The song itself is not a ruckus or rowdy type song. In fact, it's starts very light and quiet. They talk about up on the hill is how the song starts out, kind of something that they're looking up to, and moves through a progression, kind of an easy opening, and then verse and chorus, and it's broken up in the middle by a stronger piece of music that just does have a very Asian or Oriental feel. There is a keyboard with like a xylophone type effect that just has that type of feel. Little harder, little bouncier, little faster, and then it retreats back again to that quieter verse and chorus, and ends with some quiet keyboards and saxophone, especially, that kind of trails off into the distance. Kind of a nice song. It's about 7.5, 8 minutes long. That really fills out the middle of this side.
Well, I think Asia is the song Asia, I think it is the centerpiece of this album, and I think it is one of Steely Dan's more substantial pieces of music. And lyrically, it's the lyrics are fairly sparse. I mean, there's not a lot of words. Now, the Up on the Hill, like there's 3 different sort of verses or segments of the song that up on the hill, people never stare, they just don't care. and up on the hill, they've got time to burn. There's no return.
Yes.
Up on the hill, they think I'm okay, or so they say.
Yes.
And what what I think, and this isn't, I read this somewhere, so someone else, I'm
Yeah.
not, but I accept what I read was that um, they're talking about they're in L.A. and up on the hill is sort of like that's where the beautiful people are, but but what is my relation to them? And when you think of up on the hill, or when I think of up on the hill in terms of Los Angeles, a city that I have never been to, actually, but in the film Mulholland Drive,
Yes.
there's parts of the film where they're driving on Mulholland Drive and they're up in the Hollywood Hills, and it's a sort of exotic place. There's not as much light because there are homes that are kind of hidden back in the nooks and crannies of the hills and
Mm-hmm.
whatnot, and but then you can see down, and just the regular city is down there.
Yes.
And so when up on the hill, I mean that's the imagery that it conjures up in my mind when you go up there with the rich and famous, the beautiful people, whatever label you want to put. And these, Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, they were English major nerds from college,
Mm-hmm.
and here they are in Los Angeles, and even after a successful career, they're still like, up on the hill. They don't really know where they stand.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with you that the sort of the Chinese music, under the banyan trees,
Mm-hmm.
and specifically referring to Asia, who is, I think, clearly an East Asian woman.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then when all my dime dancing is
Dancing.
through, I
Yep.
run to you. Now, when I first would listen to the song, I imagined that the woman was a dime a dance person, and that's how they met. Well,
Mm-hmm.
just it doesn't take that long of looking closely at the lyrics. This is when my dime dancing is true.
Yeah.
And so here you got, we're working musicians, and when we're done, we want some more spiritual release
Mm-hmm.
than that. Um,
Yeah, something a little, a little fuller than that. And again, as opposed to I always pictured this song as opposed to a specific person. I really saw it as more of a way that that someone would like escape from. And for Steely Dan, it might be the music industry itself, which they were very cynical and distrustful and dislike the whole scene of a lot of not so much musicians, but how they had to engage with the record companies and even with the Notion, which they eventually stopped touring and all these things that you supposedly had to do. I really saw this as more of a we're going to step out of that world and into back into a different world that we just find more peaceful, more enjoyable. The interesting thing, and I mean the in the different ways that this can be perceived, again from a cynical perspective, Walter Becker was once asked about not just this but a lot of the lyrics on Asia, and his response was, "Well, the meaning is obvious." Was his was his response, and they lost the master tapes, or not that they did. The master tapes for this were lost, which is why a surround sound recording is not possible, right, for this album. And again, in a very cynical kind of way, in a re-release of this album, they did offer $600 for the return of those tapes, which again, I mean, the whole notion of how valuable these would be. I mean, just kind of like, yeah, like we're going to find these things. Was there. So, and then just the song then after the saxophone piece goes into another verse and chorus and ends with a very kind of strong ending. I see it as going back to now they're back in the grind basically. There's some fairly heavy drums and some pounding keyboards and fairly intense cymbal work that kind of takes it to the end of the song. That again, I hear the okay, we're back we're back to the hectic is what I feel at the end of the song.
The going back to the instrumental break in the middle of the song.
Yeah, the saxophone kind of
Well, and
flotation there.
there's some guitar chords in there,
Yes.
and Steely Dan is much more focused on lead guitar than rhythm guitar. I mean, the
Hmm.
guitar sound in their music is understated, and there's some relatively muscular guitar chords, non-lead guitar in the instrumental break, which sets kind of an interesting mood, and the instrument that you're referring to, it's the percussion instrument that you're referring to is a marimba
Okay.
that they play. And I'll tell you that the second time around, when a little bit heavier lead guitar is coming to the end of its line, and Donald Fagen blows a police whistle, and
Hmm.
then that marimba riff comes in, and I'll tell you, at that moment, I mean, they are flying.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's not moving. It's the song isn't a fast song, but I mean, they were at that moment when that marimba comes in. I mean, they
Yeah.
were holding the pliers. I mean, and
Exactly.
and at the end of the first instrumental break, and then at the closing segment of the song, the drummer, and this became kind of a cliche in Los Angeles. He was a jazz fusion drummer named Steve Gadd,
Hmm.
and I'd never heard of him. And the only other album that I ever owned that Steve Gadd played on that I know about was a live Al Di Meola record. He was a fusion jazz
Yeah.
player in the '70s who could play a million miles an hour and went through a very popular period back in those days. Um, but well, on Frank Zappa's Joe's Garage album, he refers to one of the band members as Steve Gadd's clone, and
Hmm.
and they're playing like the drums like they're played in the song Asia.
Yeah.
So I mean that the drumming has gotten a lot of attention, and I'm not aware of any other songs that Steely Dan songs that Steve Gadd played on, but it's like you say, it's about 8 minutes long, but that is, despite the sparseness of the lyrics, it is one of the more substantial pieces of music that Steely Dan ever put together. And it's like the sort of song that only Steely Dan could have produced, and it doesn't sound really like anything else that they did over the course of their
Yeah.
career.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which so excellent song,
Yeah.
excellent song.
And then that feeds into the final song on the side, which is actually my favorite song on the album, Deacon Blues. Another about 7.5 minute song. This one, I agree with you. Asia is certainly substantial musically, right? What it puts together, a very substantial piece of work. Deacon Blues is lighter and more straightforward, but I think it's it's a peaceful but a very sad type of song and tone, because the song is about a person who who's a loser, or at least perceives themselves as a loser. And it is very straightforward, a series of verses and choruses that are really just, playing the last thing. They replace a lyrical verse with a saxophone verse, then go right back to the chorus, and then the song kind of quietly fades out. I see it as a person is thinking or dreaming of when they can actually kind of cross that fine line from being a loser to being something better. In this particular case, it is, maybe I can be like a musician. I'll learn to work the saxophone, right? I'll play just what I feel. I'm going to drink Scotch whiskey all night long. I'm going to flame out and die behind the wheel, right? It is this vision of, I'm going to do something different and not be a loser for once, and almost picturing that in the song. just runs out very quietly to an end where I almost picture the person thinking or dreaming this as they fall asleep for the evening. And I feel it certainly resonated with me because there's times in my life where that, I have felt, what this person is feeling. And that's not necessarily okay, I'm a loser right now, but I'm working, I'm doing all these things, and I just don't feel like I'm getting anywhere. And I think that's a very common feeling of a lot of people at a lot of portions of their life. And they stop for just a second, and they think for just a second. What if I was this? What if I won the lottery? What if I could do this for a while? What if I could shift gears? And I think it's a very common feeling of life. And I think that this song reflects that in a way that just comes quietly through in the lyrics throughout the song.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, they say I want a name when I lose. I mean, the
Yes.
loser label is apt. But I think the dreamer, like the unfulfilled dreamer, is maybe more like it. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned before that Steely Dan were jazz guys, and the way that I look at it similarly to you. This isn't about a saxophone player. This is about someone who wants to be a saxophone player.
Yes. Yes.
And so you've got some guys are hanging around the dorm room listening to jazz, and they're dreaming about they don't want to go out into the rat race in the working world. They want to get up on stage and blow like Coltrane, man.
Mm-hmm.
And but that's easy to think about or to talk about, not so easy to do.
Yes.
And so it's the person is that's where they're at. They have not been able to. Now Steely Dan were able to do it. They were able to become successful musicians who made a mark in the world in the musical world. But that wasn't who they were when they first started thinking
Mm-hmm.
about music, and it's certainly not what the singer of this song is at. Um, it There's some people have called Deacon Blues the quintessential Steely Dan song because both
Mm-hmm.
musically and lyrically, it really gets to the heart of where they're coming from and what they're trying to do. And I think it's a great song. You mentioned earlier that Peg and Josie were radio hits. Deacon Blues was a radio hit, and I think Deacon Blues is it's I Asia just takes is my
Yeah.
favorite track on the album, but Deacon Blues is definitely number two in my
Yes.
opinion, and it's more it's closer to the quintessential Steely Dan song than Asia is.
And I do feel that, again, I also strongly enjoy Asia, and even saying that Deacon Blues is my favorite, I mean, this is close. It's not a runaway type thing. I think that the song itself and what it's trying to get at is just a little bit more, I guess, common man than where kind of Asia is leading. Again, Asia more substantial and musically, it's just there is a simple part of life, and I see this as a cycle that they were going through, and a lot of people go through. I mean, you hear it. This was not like a one night type thing or a one day thing where a person like, oh, I wish I was something else. I mean, I'll make it this time is one of the lyrics. I mean, I'm gonna this time this is gonna work. I'm gonna do this. And I do think that Steely Dan, they obviously knew they were successful in what they were doing. I think though that the way that their career played out, especially with, and I've talked about it a couple times, and it's just very clear in any of the interviews you read about them or hear what they said. They did not like the music business. And they did not like some of the things and the dealings that they had to do, and even them would envision a different type of way of proceeding and making music if they had the opportunity. which is true with a lot of people, even that have good jobs and decent families, that find themselves in situations where, if I could only do this. I think it's a part of every person's life, and I think that there's a part of that in this song. That's always resonated with me.
It's a good one. It's a good one.
Absolutely. So I'm going to close on this. I have one thing that I just in doing some of the putting together this, there was something that I'd ask your opinion on this. Steely Dan, as complex as challenging as the music can be, is nowadays termed by a lot of people to be yacht rock. And when I think of yacht rock, I think of Christopher Cross. I think of the Pina Colada song. These are what come there. But clearly, in a lot of conversations, any music that is gentle and easy to listen to, you've got some Boz Scaggs. You've got Michael McDonald is absolutely yacht rock. So I'd be curious on your thoughts about the positioning of Steely Dan as yacht rock.
I disapprove of Steely Dan as yacht rock. I mean, although I think that when Steely Dan was making music, and specifically right about the time of Asia, is probably when yacht rock really came around.
Late 70s.
But
yep.
I would, if you were to ask me to say name two artists that were yacht rock, I would say the Little River Band, an Australian band from the late 70s, and Pablo Cruz, a California band from the
They go to
late
Rio.
70s.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so Steely Dan, I believe, rises above any of the artists that we've mentioned, and that yacht rock is it's a limiting. It's they transcend that label.
There is a certain derogatory feeling to the notion of being labeled as yacht rock. Although I think we can end here, looping back to what I said at the very beginning about Steely Dan and about this album. One of the things about it, and which I think was a successful aspect of them making this music, is it was accessible from all types of distances. And yacht rock, for sure, is very accessible at a distance. It has this pleasant feel that is easy and unchallenging to listen to. And I do feel that Steely Dan, if that's the way you want to listen to it, is a good, accessible experience. It just has a higher levels than that. So I guess I don't have a problem with it. I just think it's a lot more, falls into a lot of different dimensions as well.
I can't argue with you on that.
All right, that was Steely Dan Asia, Side 1. Good conversation, good show, Mike. And we will catch you all the next time on The Sideshow.